So, good afternoon, everybody, or evening, morning, wherever you are. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us for this first webinar of the Special Interest Group on the Semiotics of Peace, Compassion and Empathy. Apologies from our President Elizabeth Thompson this afternoon. She's actually on the road. She has joined us, so but yes, she's on the road, so I'm taking over hosting. Okay, in the spirit of reconciliation, we'd first like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands on which we meet today and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. We recognise their continued connection to the land and waters and acknowledge that they have never ceded sovereignty. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. Everyone will be on mute. Please post any questions into the chat and we'll have around 30 minutes at the end of the talk. Penny Wheeler and Auni Ataiwe will collate questions as they come through and present these to Jim to respond to in question time. So we're delighted and extremely privileged to kick off this 2025 webinar series with our very special speaker today, Professor Jim Martin, who of course needs no introduction. Jim introduced the notion of positive discourse analysis in a 2002 article, Blessed Are the Peacemakers, Reconciliation and Evaluation. And then his 2004 article, Positive Discourse Analysis, Solidarity and Change, then laid the groundwork for a methodological approach that calls for, and I quote from the introduction to volume 6 of the collected works of J.R. Martin, an interventionist stance in ideologically oriented discourse analysis, focusing on analysis of and participation in sites of successful social change. This approach underpins the work of this SIG on the semiotics of peace, compassion and empathy, which is so important in these times of conflict all over the world. And this segues into today's presentation, Secular Communion, So Much Trouble in the World. Please make welcome for us, Professor Jim Martin. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ingrid, and thank you, organizing team, for the invitation. It's really a delight to be able to talk to you, and I'm a great fan of your work, as I hope you know. Okay, so that's my topic, and I don't know if you get the intertext reference, but it's an old Bob Marley song, favorite of mine. Okay, now click. So I'm going to begin with 2 stories, and then I'll say something about bonding, something about iconization, something about constellations, something about war, and something about hope. So that's the plan. Okay, so we'll begin with 2 stories, which I'll refer to as Shoes and Booze for short, and we'll start off with field of sport. Test cricket in particular, and episode in the history of Australian cricket that took place a couple of years ago and has been ongoing since that time, actually. So for those of you who aren't Australian cricket fans, then this is a picture of Usman Khawaja, who's an opening batsman for the Australian Test team in cricket. And in December 13th, I'm going to have to move you, Ingrid. 2023, Australian cricketer Usman Khawaja, an Australian-born Muslim of Pakistani heritage, made a request to the International Cricket Council to wear the following messages on his shoes during the first test match against Pakistan. All lives are equal. Freedom is a human right. The International Cricket Council, ICC, refused, citing its code of conduct. And I won't read it all out to you, but it's the predictable sport and politics don't mix kind of messaging. Players are not permitted to wear, display, or otherwise convey personal messages unless approved in advance. Approval shall not be granted for messages which relate to political, religious, or racial activities or causes. no doubt taking into account the colors used and the political timing of the messages. During the first test, supporting banners in the crowd were removed. Quadra complied, but wore a black armband. I can't read my slide until you admit that person wore a black armband during the first test and was reprimanded by the ICC for doing so. His appeal against the reprimand was later rejected. Quadra then applied to Cricket Australia. Sorry, I don't know if I can move these messages. I can't seem to. Who agreed that he be allowed to wear the symbol of a black dove and a reference to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights on his bat and shoes for the upcoming Melbourne and Sydney tests, the second and third tests. Quadra's application to the ICC was as follows. I feel strongly about the right of every human being to enjoy peace, freedom, and equality in dignity and rights, regardless of their gender, age, color, race, language, religion, or national or social origin. Some human rights are inalienable and transcend all our differences. These rights are enshrined in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, that has been ratified by all member states of the United Nations. At a time when there's such a loss of life and liberty in the world, most recently in the Middle East, I would like to promote a personal message of peace, freedom, and equality by displaying an internationally recognized symbol of peace and freedom, a dove with a sprig on the back of my bat, together with the phrase, O1 UDHR. At a time like this, I think it's incumbent on everyone to do what they can to promote these fundamental rights. I believe that displaying the above logo on my bat is a small but meaningful way to do this. In my application, I've been guided by the need to be proportional and mindful of other approved and/or permitted messages by teams and/or individuals. The permission approved by an emergency meeting of the Cricket Australia Board was, however, struck down by the ICC, again citing its code of conduct. So instead, Quadra wore the names of his daughters on his shoes throughout the test series, Aisha and Isla. The names, of course, were by then much more than a passing reference to his children. The ICC, ironically, by attempting to block Quadra's message, radically empowered it. The shoes became axiologically charged as symbols of protest against the death of innocent children in the Middle East, a semogenic process I will refer to as iconisation. And after a while, you could buy a t-shirt with shoes with the original inscriptions on them. I've teamed up with Electric Wiki to bring you the Aussie Freedom and Equality t-shirts, Quadra wrote in a post to his following of more than 1 million on X and Instagram. All profits will be donated to the UNICEF Children of Gaza Appeal. For those who can, please purchase to help support those who are struggling and spread the word. Okay, so a very canonical iconization process that we followed from beginning to end. And it calls to mind, of course, CLR James. What do they know of cricket? Who only cricket know? Booze, Australian rules, football. There's a photo of Adam Goods in his Sydney Swans uniform. And for the many of those around your world who are here today, this is in relation to an Australian version of football called Australian Rules. Adam Goods was an outstanding Indigenous Australian rules football player. His mother is an Aboriginal Australian, Angie Mathana and Naranga, and she's one of the stolen generation. In May 2013, during the AFL's annual Indigenous round, a 13-year-old girl called Goods an ape during a match against Collingwood. Goods pointed her out to officials, and she was removed from the game. Goods said he was gutted and that he'd never been more hurt, but nevertheless called on the community to support the girl instead of blame her. He spoke to her the following day after she phoned to apologize, saying that she had not realized how deeply it had affected him. Goods repeated that the girl should not be blamed. The environment that she grew up in had shaped her response. Over the following years of his career, and particularly in 2015, Goods was repeatedly and loudly booed by opposition fans at most matches. During a match against Carlton in May 2015, again during the AFL's annual Indigenous round, Goods celebrated a goal by performing an Indigenous war cry in which he mimed throwing a boomerang, though widely reported as a spear, in the direction of the Carlton cheer squad. Goods said after the incident the dance was based on what he learned from the under-16s Indigenous team, the Flying Boomerangs, and it was designed as an expression of Indigenous pride during Indigenous round, not as a means of offending or intimidating the crowd. Owing to the stress caused by the booing and attention, Goods took indefinite leave from the game in August of the 215 season. He returned the following week and played for the remainder of the season after an outpouring of support on social media and from fans, actors, politicians, celebrities, and teammates, including 2 spontaneous standing ovations. Goods retired from AFL in September 2015. He did not attend the grand final, where retiring players traditionally take part in a parade, one of only a handful of players to decline this invitation since the parade for retiring players was established. In 2012, he rejected an invitation to join AFL's Hall of Fame. He's not watched any AFL matches since that time. Probably should be 2022, sorry. It was, of course, a very different reaction from home fans in Sydney, including support from Indigenous teammates, imitating his boomerang throwing gesture. And retrospective apologies and honors. In 2023, the Sydney Swans unveiled a bronze sculpture of Indigenous superstar Adam Goods out front of the Swans' new headquarters, including 2 documentaries about the tragic end to his brilliant football career, The Final Quarter and The Australian Dream. And iconisation via the Aboriginal flag. Note in this case the polarizing impact of the iconizing process, villain versus hero, a point I'll return to in my discussion below, since for every belonging there is an inside and an outside, and us and a them. As Firth commented, a speech fellowship sees itself and hears itself as different from those who do not belong. Such speech, besides being a bond among fellows, is a bar to the outsider. Okay, so those were the 2 stories as background to what we're talking about today. I want to say some things now about bonding and the notion of sharing feelings. So this takes us back to appraisal and the framework for analyzing evaluation and discourse that Peter White and I and many others designed through the 1990s and published later on in 2005, with its central categories of attitude, affect, judgment, appreciation, resources for sourcing those monoglossically or heteroglossically, and resources for force and focus graduation. It wasn't designed, although it's often misunderstood, as a technique for sentiment analysis. It was designed as a technique for discourse analysis. And in the analyses in the book, we did try to clearly lay out that it was very important to see how the attitude was coupled with ideation when you're doing analysis, both with the target or trigger, the appraised, in relation to the attitude, and the source of the appraisal, the appraiser. And I think our tables show that, although not always taken up in those terms. Perhaps a diagram of this kind would have helped, using the yin-yang coupling of appraisal and appraised to capture the essential necessity of interpreting a text in terms of the attitude and how it's triggered, or what it's targeted towards, and also where it's coming from, the appraiser. These couplings, of course, as we comment in the book, and I've tried to comment many times, are tended to be shared. We don't talk to express our feelings, we talk to share our feelings with people that we're communicating with. Perhaps a diagram of this kind would have made that more clear. Naomi Knight, of course, was instrumental in introducing the notion of bond, our basic phoneme of solidarity, sociality, individuation, if you like, and pointing out that you could call a shared feeling from an appraiser and shared by another appraiser in relation to a targeted or triggered attitude. So we have the notion of bond as a shared feeling. And then the question is, how do those bonds cluster in relation to a particular community where Ani has done the key work with Michel, but a lot on his own, developing the notion of bond clusters as ways of characterizing community. And there's a diagram of his showing a particular cluster in relation to the running shoe manufacturer's Puma and some of the attitudes that were tabled to be shared about them. And also makes the important point that these bond clusters are often polarized. There's an inside and outside, if you like, going in both directions. So there's a polarization of bond complexes that we can see. Outgroup centered bonds cluster, in-loop centered bonds cluster, and so on. So the notion of a bond and a bond cluster is very important to our understanding of individuation in SFL and what we mean from a linguistic point of view about what a community is. And for more on that, you can have a look at the publication that the people organizing this meeting edited for Language, Context, and Text. So a nice collection of papers representing the work in general, including some more of Ani's work there. We'll return to the issue of how bonds complex below. I want to say some things now about iconization in the context of the bonding discussion we just had. You could think of it as a kind of hyperbonding. So iconization is a condensation process as far as interpersonal meaning is concerned, a process whereby ideation accrues value. Logogenetically in a text as it unfolds, ontogenetically for an individual in their lifetime, phylogenetically in a subculture or a culture, generational time. It's a two-way process whereby the ideational meaning of an event or entity is backgrounded and its axiological significance to the members of a group is foregrounded, or vice versa. Thus, ideational meaning loses focus as axiological meaning is charged, or ideational meaning sharpens focus as axiological meaning is discharged. It's very familiar to us in lots of the work that we've already been worried about for decades. In idioms, for example, if you look at Chong Chang-Wang's work, we have the idiom cool as a cucumber, which we interpret as a next to inscribed attitude, imperturbable. We don't really think about the cucumber when we hear the metaphor. It's ideationally backgrounded. What's foregrounded is the attitudinal meaning in idioms of this kind. Also, lexical metaphors. If we say South African politics erupted in a rebellion in the black townships throughout the country, we don't think really literally about volcanoes, but we think about the explosion of protest in Soweto and other communities during the movement for liberation in South Africa. So we have the notion of an explosive release of pressure. Also, interpersonal grammatical metaphors. If we have an explicitly subjective modalization realized by a first-person present tense process of cognition, as in this example, then we have another example of the ideational meaning backgrounded in the service of the interpersonal. So a little bit of Holmes and Watson dialogue. Watson, you realize we've only stopped for breath since this thing started. Has it occurred to you? Probably, says Sherlock, facetiously. No, has it occurred to you that the bomber's playing a game with you? The envelope, breaking into the other flat, the dead kid's shoes, it's all meant for you. Yes, I know. Okay, so a very common kind of interaction with Holmes and Watson. So Holmes knows perfectly well that Watson is modalizing, pretends he doesn't recognize that, interprets it literally by saying probably it has occurred to me, and of course it has, since everything Watson has thought of, Holmes has thought of already. In Helen Capel's work on nuclear news stories, there's lots of examples of editors enjoying using images to reinvest idioms in headings with ideational meaning. So getting the cold shoulder, literally and figuratively there. Marie Stangley makes the point that over time, text time, lifetime, generational time, a bond may become supercharged in an iconization process leading to what she calls bondicons, short for bonding icons. Centers of gravity for sociality, we might say, i.e. centers, nuclear centers for bond complexes. Among well-known bondicons are symbols of peace, which anchor communities of protest against war. Iconization can also involve people, including well-known embodiments of peaceful protest and of liberation, such as Gandhi and Mandela. Further examples would include ceremonies, proverbs, slogans, memorable quotations, flags, team colors, coats of arms, mascots, and so on. Here's the Shanghai Jiaotong insignia, Aboriginal flag, Sydney Uni, and so on. Also, inspirational passages of discourse, favorite little phases of discourse. I originally gave this talk in Mexico, so I won't read out the Spanish to you, but translate it for you. It's a brilliant little micro cuento from my favorite Latin American author, Eduardo Galeano, called Grapes and Wine. So it says that a wine grower on his deathbed spoke into the ear of Marcella, and before dying, he revealed to her his secret. And he said, "Wine," he whispered, "is made of grapes." Sorry, grapes, he said, are made of wine. Oops. And Marcella told it to me. And I thought, if it's the case that grapes are made of wine, maybe we are the words that speak what we are. Okay. It always manages to capture in a few words some things that are very crucial, and it kind of sums up all of our interest in individuation there in that passage. So hypercharged bond, or bondicon. For example, Adam Goods. A bondicon for some, an anticon, anti-hero for others. Good example of an iconizing process is the Qantas flying kangaroo symbol. In its evolution, things look quite different 100 years ago. The airline's first name was briefly Western Queensland Auto Aero Services Limited. Something unpronounceable there. Croissant. In 1930, the Qantas logo gained its wings, taking the airline through its early days in the lead up to becoming an international airline. In 1935, the first flights departed for Singapore. In 1944, Qantas added this emblem to its flights across the Indian Ocean. Design was based on the penny coin and was known as the Kangaroo Service. The logo was unveiled in 1947. The penny kangaroo was hopping the globe, took passengers on the famous kangaroo route. So kangaroo is a nice metaphor because it took so many stops to get around the world. And this bold new look in 1968 when the Boeing 707s were flying customers around. And then the logo lost its wings in 1984 and lost its feet in 2016. So I don't know how many people around the world would recognize the logo now as kangaroo. It's become ideationally attenuated and its symbolic significance for the airline amplified. Thanks to iconisation, if you're at the wrong place in the wrong time, you might well get arrested for eating watermelon. Georgia Carr notes that it is possible to iconize attitude as well as ideation, as what we think of as values. And her book has recently appeared, The Language of Sex Education. As Georgia suggests, just as we can technicalize ideation or appraisal, we can also iconize ideation or appraisal. So the little diagram there from George's work is showing, okay, we can have technicalized ideation, a technical term of some kind. We can also have axiological technical terms. So the contrast we're working on here is, the idea of murder, okay, a technical term like that. And so the axiological technical term, murder, as opposed to a technical term like court or judge or lawyer, or something like that. And then iconized ideation would be the bonding icons, of which we saw several examples. And we can also have axiological bonding icons, we'll talk about in a sec. Her particular focus was on the technicalization of consent as axitech. So we have its everyday meaning, but we also have its technical meaning in the law, okay, where its ideational, interpersonal meaning is erased in a sense because we have to make judgments about whether someone has consented or not to having sexual relations. And respect, she looks at something that is already an attitudinal term, how it gets axiologically charged in sex education. So I hope this diagram will help to keep in mind what we're talking about here. We can have technical terms like judge, juror, lawyer, things like that from a specialized field. And then in that same field, we can have axitech, so homicide, murder, manslaughter, euthanasia, where we have axiologized technicality, but the technicality has taken the attitude out of things so that we can have a firm, clear, criterial adjudication in the legal process. Then in terms of bondicon, something like I can't breathe that phrase became a bondicon for Black rights movements around the world. And Black Lives Matter also iconized there, the idea that Black Lives Matter, so something that is attitudinal, then becomes axiologically charged, okay, supercharged as an axicon for that community. So then we have both bondicons and axicons acting as radiating centers for bond complexes. Quadri's universal direction of human rights, of course, is axicons. So if we look at these human rights, and I won't have time to go through all the different points of the Universal Declaration there that he was referring to. Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Through iconization, we discharge the ideation of the appraiser and appraised by weakening the classification of who is appraising and what is being appraised. So, for example, with the human rights, who's the appraiser? I mean, is it the UN 1948, 48 countries who introduced this? Is it Western nations? Is it liberals? Who exactly are we sourcing this to? And who is being appraised? Kind of seems like everyone in the world, all human beings, it would seem, but there would be people interested in extending that to animal rights and so on. And there have been various treaties and so on, interesting who subscribes to all of them, and some of them or a few of them around the world. Iconization condenses the types of attitude involved at the same time as it's hypercharging the attitude. These are coding nightmares. Trying to code an axicon is a horrible thing to try to do from the point of view of appraisal analysis. Does human rights embrace affect and or judgment and or appreciation? What exactly are we doing when we try to code something like that? Obviously, there's several of the articles that seem to foreground affect. Everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections. We have judgment. No one shall be subjected to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. We have appreciation. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being. Motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. So, iconized attitude, weakly classified ideation, strongly condensed attitude of all kinds, typically, in an axicon. We end up with the iconization of feelings as these totemized things we refer to, I think, in everyday language as values. Constellations. Back to Ani's work on bond complexing. In our work on youth justice conferencing, Michelle and Paul Dwyer and I try to work at a rich typology of kinds of bondicon, which is represented in this taxonomy. And I'll just go through these, just remind ourselves about the range of things we're looking at here. And I'll draw on one meeting of the Sydney Peace Foundation, annual meeting, and talk about configuring bonds around bondicons in relation to one of my Canadian heroes, Naomi Klein, who won the 2016 Sydney Peace Prize. She's a climate change activist, as you probably know, and also involved in advocacy for boycott, divest, sanction against Israel. She's one of my heroes. Example of an image of the Sydney Peace Prize. A little bit of Opera House, a little bit of Dove of Peace there. You actually do get something if you win the prize, as illustrated here, an artifact. There are phrases, as we've seen already. This changes everything. One of her well-known phrases from the cover of her well-known book. We have little stories, little parables, unlimited growth, underpins neoliberal capitalism. And we have ceremonies like the Sydney Peace Prize with the guests and all the things we went through that evening to celebrate Naomi Klein's work. So you may end up with quite a cluster of these bondicons as the radiating heart of bond complexes. That's how I imagine Ani's work evolving, and go Ani, keep going, and people please join him as we try to work out from a linguistic point of view what we mean by individuation and what kind of work and study we do in that area. But keep in mind Ani's opposing bond clusters, because in tension with Klein's climate change advocacy, we of course have climate change denialists, some of whom are very well known and very powerful men in the world. So individuation probably looks a little more like this in many cases. And as we've seen for Adam Goods, one community's hero, bondicon, may be another community's villain, anticon. As for the slogan, from the river to the sea, we need to keep in mind that iconization is a powerful resource both for celebration and for denigration. Okay, let's just for a moment take a little glance backwards to 9/11 from some papers that I edited after that event. Phil Graham and colleagues opened their paper on George Bush's war on terror with the following quote from Goring on leading a populace to war, which remains so true. Why, of course, the people don't want war. Why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best that he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor for that matter in Germany. That's understood. But after all, it's the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That's easy. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country. Alongside the patriotism and vulnerability bond complexing flagged in Goring's words, we also need to take into account the demonization of the enemy, inevitably accompanying such processes. In this regard, both Graham and Lazar comment insightfully on the iconization process of othering, the latter they refer to as e-vilification, in response to America's demonizing of Saddam Hussein in preparation for launching the Iraq War. For me, this raises a number of questions about the role of iconization in licensing war. And there's the reference to that issue of discourse in society if you want to follow up these papers and learn again about history repeating itself. So I have a few questions, and closing down, I'll just raise two. Are bondicons and the tribal belongings they anchor more powerful than axicons and their more diffuse global belongings? Recall that with axicons, feelings are condensed and their ideational sources and targets triggers are diffused. Does the non-specificity of the feelings and the weak classification of sources and targets triggers weaken their gravity, their solar power? especially when faced with tribal bonding around specific judgments by particular groups. The attitude of Collingwood fans to Adam Goodes as a bully, the attitude of Geelong fans, probably the only thing that Geelong fans and Collingwood fans have in common, that they could bond around. They hate each other, of course, but that they could bond around. The anti-con of Goodes. Well, belongings anchored by bondicons tend to overcome belongings anchored by axicons when push comes to shove. When we're dealing with an anticon like Adam Goodes, do the tribal belongings overcome what we might think of as human rights, common human decency? So will tribal belongings generally overpower more global ones? Survival of the group, not the species? Are shoes doomed to lose to booze? Two, what happens when a community invests heavily in othering, in what they're against rather than what they are? If we take the climate change binary constellation, for example, what happens if anchoring bondicons wane, leaving one group defined mainly by anticons? In relation to the climate change complexes noted above, what happens if anchoring bondicons wave, leaving a group defined mainly by anticons? A group of this kind would mainly align itself in opposition to climate change denial, but not be prepared themselves to enact meaningful socioeconomic change required to arrest global heating. A negatively defined community. In such cases, can the iconisation process of other lead to an ever more intense evilification and dehumanization of the other? And will the fostering of anticons ultimately lead to a license to kill, a free pass for war, a free pass for genocide? So we have two very, very interesting, thorough, and detailed books to think about in terms of the Middle East, in terms of these processes that I'm referring to. One by Akkad, an interesting analysis of how the West comes to turn a blind eye to things happening in the Middle East and will pretend they didn't afterwards. And another about the victimization of especially Palestinian women and children and the effacement of Palestinian men as part of the process. What is ultimately licensed by othering of this kind? As former IDF soldier and historian Omar Bartov recently observed on his visit to Israel, for even his left-leaning liberal friends, Israel's survival is the preeminent concern, whatever price Palestinians must pay. Quoting, many of my friends recognize the injustice of the occupation, and as Smilansky said, profess a love for humanity. But at this moment, under these circumstances, this is not what they're focused on. Instead, they feel that in the struggle between justice and existence, existence must win out. And in the struggle between one just cause and another, that of the Israelis and that of the Palestinians, it's their own cause that must be triumphant, no matter the price. To those who doubt this stark choice, the Holocaust is presented as the alternative, however irrelevant it is to the current moment. There are, of course, alternative Jewish voices resisting dehumanizing anticons and promoting human rights anticons. The Jewish Council of Australia is a good example of voices of this kind. And they do speak on behalf of axicons, on behalf of the axicons of human rights, for example. We are proud Jewish people in Australia with diverse histories, traditions, and politics. We're committed to the values of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, calling out injustice, challenging assumptions, and promoting debate. We reject the assertion that Jews and the state of Israel are one and the same, or that all Jewish people support without criticisms the actions of the Israeli government and military. Pro-Israel Jewish organizations that do not recognize the diversity of views among Australian Jews do not speak for us. While we have diverse views on many issues, we are united in our opposition to Israel's continued policies aimed at the destruction of Palestinian life. We are opposed to the Israeli occupation and the prioritization of the rights of Jewish people over the rights of Palestinians. Jewish safety is not at odds with Palestinian freedom. We support calls for freedom, equality, and justice for all Palestinians and Israelis. We reject any claim that this call is racist or anti-Semitic, or that it's anti-Semitic to criticize Israel's conduct. Racism and anti-Semitism are on the rise in Australia. The only way to effectively fight anti-Semitism is by committing to work in solidarity with other groups facing bigotry and discrimination to fight all forms of racism. A good message for my Vice Chancellor. Okay, all a bit depressing. I'll try to end on a more positive note. Talk about hope for a little bit. SFL is an extravagant theory. And its overall architecture, I've synopsized in an iPhone this diagram there, where I've tried to position axis system structure relations at the heart of everything, and then refer to our three hierarchies: instantiation, the relation of system to text; individuation, the relation of the system to persona; and realization, our best developed hierarchy with its dimensions of metafunction and rank and strata. And we pride ourselves in our dialectic of theory, description, and practice, which gave that superstructure the shape it has. I've tried to survey today the work on bonding and iconisation our colleagues have been doing in Australia to further develop SFL as a genuinely social theory of language and a more effective tool for CDA, PDA initiatives around the world. But for all our 1960s idealism, privileged boomers like me have not stopped war, have not avoided climate change. We have such a shameful legacy to bear. As a ray of hope, I think there's one powerful dimension of global bonding we can leverage. So I'll use a picture of my very young granddaughter, Remy, to springboard this part of the talk. Go back to Quadri's intervention and what inspired it. What I wrote on my shoes in Perth, I thought about it for a while, he said on Friday. I made sure I didn't want to segregate different parts of the population, religious beliefs, and communities. I wanted it to be really broad because I'm speaking about humanitarian issues. The reason I'm doing it is because it hit me hard when I'm looking at my Instagram and seeing innocent kids, videos of them dying, passing away. That's what hit me the hardest. I just imagine my young daughter in my arms. I get emotional talking about it again. I don't have any hidden agendas. If anything, this brings up more negativity towards me. I don't get anything out of this. And children are a powerful totem and have been iconized in relation to the American war in Vietnam. And in relation to Syrian refugees, just noting Tuan Van Dijk's new book, he's discovered PDA, by the way, so very timely. Syrian refugees. Or Gaza. Would be nice if they had hospitals like that to actually recover in. First Dog on the Moon plays this card in his protest against what's happening, with 5 panels going through the, well, let's just call it what it is, murder of individual Palestinian children in relation to birthday party for Toto. Who do we value more? Prime Minister's dog or children elsewhere? And I don't know if you listened to the podcast by Mohammed Mustafa, which is pretty hard to listen to, but touring Australia, I think, currently, trying to get some help for children in Gaza. We don't have to be a major player in the Middle East to feed children. We don't have to be a major player to heal children, to help them. Or children and grandchildren anywhere. As we know from Latin America, the voice of the madres and abuelas on behalf of their own and others' children given time can be a powerful force. Here's a couple from Israel. Veronica Cohen, 80, a Holocaust survivor who was born in the ghetto in Budapest, said she came to protest outside the Yad Vashem on the Day of Remembrance because I don't think we can remember our suffering without acknowledging the suffering of Gaza, the death of tens of thousands of children, the starvation that's going on this minute, for which we are partially responsible. It occupies the same place in my heart. Or the standing together, commenting there's nothing new about the attempt recently to silence any mention of Gaza. The only difference this time, the police foolishly put it in writing so they could challenge it in court. The group not only successfully challenged the ban in court, but also then began taking donations to put the photos of Gaza child victims of war on posters and bus stops across central Israel, with almost 200 and counting. The voice of the madres and abuelas on behalf of the children is a powerful appraiser in these contexts. Bears thinking about in terms of iconization. Their ceremonial walks and marches day after day. We need more shoes, less booze. To end on a lighter note, let me leave you with some photos of a recently iconized friendship near Hobart in Tasmania, Australia. Meet George and Raphael, two inseparable companions. A cockatoo and lorikeet. If you haven't had a chance to see Northern Land yet, it's also very relevant to the discussion today. Thank you for your attention. The paper coming out of this talk will be published next year. I can give you a draft in the meantime if you are interested in that. And thank you very much for listening. Okay.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was fabulous. And just, yeah, such a lovely way to end as well. Time for questions. If people have got questions or comments or anything you want to put into the chat, Penny and Auni will be able to pass those on.
I'll assume you're going to read them out, Penny or Annie. Is that right?
You're on mute, Penny.
I can't hear.
Sorry. Yes, there you go.
Sorry, my internet dropped out and I failed to come back as a host. We've got a question already from Beverly, which is stating the issue of the hostages as well in Israel. I wanted, and we're welcoming everyone's questions on that, on the whole talk. So I don't know, Beverly, whether that was more of a comment than a question to Jim. What about the Israeli children who have been killed or taken hostage? I also had a question, Jim, myself, if I could jump in. You said that it was a nightmare to code axicons. Did I get that?
Yep.
Is that also related to the problem that you need to be in the group to understand the
I think that's a very good point. Of course, you're not going to appreciate the axicological charge in the axicon or the bondicon unless you're a member of that group or someone who in some sense is repelled by that axicon or bondicon. So yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, all of that sort of reading of individuation in terms of these bonds and the nuclearity of the bonds and the bond clustering is you really need the privilege of belonging to the group or becoming some kind of insider to the group to analyze. I agree. That's a good point, important point. Yeah.
and Shushi, I'll just repeat your question. Shushi was chatting to me, so her message has just come to me. Her query, are you saying the way to get to all this is to examine the couplings of ideational and interpersonal meanings and their clusters? So, Shushi, what do you mean by to get to all this as well, to help Jim?
I mean, I sort of proposing it as a technique for trying to explore what we mean by community, or thinking what would the organization of our work be along the individuation climb hierarchy, however we want to think about it, but what lives there. And what lives there, it seems to me, that we can get our hands on as linguists is bonds and clusters of bonds, and the notion of axicons and bondicons anchoring clusters of bonds. I think Ani's shown us how to do that kind of work, and maybe he'd like to comment now. But if that's what you mean, Shushi, by what we're trying to get at, I think we're trying to get at what is a community from a linguistic point of view.
I'm just trying to unmute myself. Thanks, Penny. Yes, I was asking you the way in, the analytical way in. So I can see what you're saying here, and I'm suggesting to you to answer, is the analytical way in to explore couplings and their clusters like Aoni has done to get to these bigger ideas of, the way we bond or don't, but the way we other or bond, I guess.
Yeah, I'm sort of trying to come off Naomi's work and say, okay, I think she discovered the phoneme of sociality, the phoneme of community, the bond, and then what we can do with that, how we can push that idea as far as we can push it until we need to do something else or it breaks or whatever. But I think it's all we have going for us really now in terms of what we mean as linguists by community, rather than just talking in common sense terms.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Ani, did you have anything further you wanted to add before we go on to other questions?
Not really. That was well said by Jim. I just had probably another question, if that's possible, before you go to the next. Yeah, currently I'm working with a colleague of mine here at CDU on positive environmental journalism. And we look at current literature focusing on lexical choices, negative versus positive, and what kind of language we can use. And we started with the macroscopic view, doing corpus linguistic analysis of collocation analysis, climate, followed by what, accompanied by which words. Then we noticed that, yes, there are some negative lexical choices and positive lexical choices, but that kind of corpus linguistic analysis doesn't tell us what the journalistic article is trying to do in terms of bringing society to support certain actions or to leave some other harmful practices. So we started with that macroscopic view using corpus linguistics, but then we argued that the new way of meaning, as Halliday puts it, and Mattison in his latest work, a new way of meaning is to think about negotiation of bonds in discourse as a way of it. So that's why we took the other step in the same article, taking the bond as the phoneme there, and then how a supportive community might be built against the harmful practices. So I imagine that what Jim is saying is powerful in terms of, yes, we can take that bond as the constitutive or the generative, we take its generative power as the initial step, but then how the entire community is negotiated and built, and relying traditionally on corpus linguistics to look at lexical choices, I don't think is enough in examining how communities are built around such issues. So my question is to Jim, would it be more useful to bring corpus linguistics into dialogue with what we are trying to do now to justify to the rest of the linguists around the world the value of our kind of work, or we just engage with what we are doing?
It's always useful to play the scientific card, the digital card, the empirical card, to try to get your work better recognized. I guess the question with corpus linguistics, you can still see my slides, right? To what extent can the corpus linguistics actually give us what we want, which is the appraisal, the appraised, the two appraisers, and I don't know how easy it is. It's a lot of frustrating work to get something close to this. And then I don't know if the corpus linguistic can't really get at the notion of a shared bond. That's very difficult to do. And then it's beyond its reach, I think, to get into describing and doing the kind of discourse analysis that you do that shows how the bonds actually cluster and constellate, which is what we're really interested in terms of how communities are formed. So it's always good to reach out to that kind of work because it has so much status, in a discipline like linguistics that likes to think that sometimes that it's a science, and it's always good. But, well, you have to be cautious of how far it can take you, yeah, and not let it take you over. So.
We've got some, Ian, I've been trying to unmute you, but I'm not able to. I might ask Ingrid to do that in a few minutes. Some interesting foundational questions coming up in the chat from Wen Tao saying how, what are values? Lexicons are formed based on values, but for example, a judge makes judgment of the accused behaviours according to the laws. So are values involved here? And two from Thomas, perhaps related, how do you establish that an image is a bondicon?
Okay, so in terms of the one task question and the legal discourse and so on, I mean, the whole point of legal discourse is to establish axitech, okay? To take things that, in some sense, okay, do matter to us in a community, but to technicalize them in a way that they can be adjudicated so that you can have criteria, explicit criteria to decide whether consent has been given or murder has been done or manslaughter has been done and come up with a definitive thing. Whereas, as we know from attitude in general, everything is very gradable and you can be more and less something and can be more or less mean and all that sort of stuff. So if you take the whole legal system as a kind of response, a technical ideational response to something interpersonal, the values of community, you might say. So in the phylogenesis of the legal discourse, behind that, and the transformation and evolution of legal discourse, behind that is the values of the community, but the whole point of the legal discourse is to get rid of attitude so they can make criterial decisions. Now, you can't help evaluating what they do when they make their decisions from your non-legal judgment, your judgmental ways of thinking about things. So the values are always implicated, but the legal system is trying to squash that. And what was the second point then?
The other query was from Thomas.
How do we know?
How do you know? How do you know that an image is in fact a bondicon?
I don't think you can tell, in terms of the question that you raised earlier, you can't tell by just looking at it. You can't tell. I mean, you have to understand its role in the community and its genesis and how the role it plays in the what a group of people do with it, bonding around it and forming a bigger group bonding around it, and interrelating it with other bonds and so on. So you can't possibly know, I don't think. Other than, you can do some things from the infographic analysis I did with Len, it'll be ideationally attenuated. You might be asking yourself, why is this image, or if that's what you're worried about, ideationally attenuated, and be asking yourself, well, maybe it's ideationally attenuated because it's being iconized, and there's something else that's important there, but you're not going to, by looking at the image and notice the attenuation of the ideation, like blurry, less explicit, more stylized, more aesthetic. You're not going to be able to tell from that per se what is the attitude or that's being charged, and what kind of community is it functioning as a bondicon for. You won't be able to tell. It's a bigger analysis. It's a bigger text analysis that you have to do.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Ian?
Okay, thanks very much for your talk, Jim. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I was teaching coupling, individuation, and affiliation to some postgrad students yesterday, and I wish they were able to take a look at this presentation because of the clarity of the way you presented it. So I hope it's going to be available as a video sometime. Yeah, to get to my question, many people know that I have this PhD student who's currently stuck in Gaza, and he's busy working on finishing his PhD. And I'm sort of trying to look forward to what work we can do together after the PhD. Myself as a South African and him as a Palestinian. And I was wondering if there are any sort of things that you think would be just really intriguing types of data that it would be useful to look into to analyze this area further, and particularly, of course, in service of peace building.
I think pushing at how do bonds constellate, and how do they gravitationally hover and start being attracted to and orbit around bondicons and axicons. Like anything that you can help in that kind of area would be very valuable. And it's, well, your own history in South Africa, study successful change there. Let's assume, hopefully, that something less bad starts happening in Gaza, and maybe start monitoring that. I mean, I don't think it's really productive to be necessarily worrying and thinking about from a CDA perspective all the vilification and so on, but take the sort of PDA turn. And yeah, the desperate thing we need, and we just have so little superstructure, understanding, knowledge of ways of proceeding when it comes to individuation. I would charge after that. And I hope your colleague survives to do it with you. I hope so. Yeah. That must be terrible.
Needs all of our prayers and support.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And in terms of the video, I think I'll get a copy of the video, and if people email me, I can share it somehow. It's too big, obviously, to send by email, but we can find a way around that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Jim, an observation from Tahira Nayab. I think humans use language to resolve issues, while the inhuman use power to crush the issue.
I think, unfortunately, language is always involved, so there's no escape for linguists. But of course, I mean, we use our language, our technology to construe our science, and from the science to build our technology. And through that, we can, in very, very powerful ways, engage with the material world. There's always language behind it at one stage, but yeah, there is a material effect, and war is one of those obliterating effects that the science and technology affords. Once driven by the humanities, once driven by the values and iconization processes that unleash the damage.
Mary, did you want to ask your question to Jim?
Hi, Jim.
Hi, Mary.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. Really important work, and I feel very lucky to have caught it. My question is about the theorizing of context. I know I shouldn't ask you this because we have a theory of context of some sort, but it seems to me from your response to the question about how you decide if something is an icon, your response was about context, about how do you decide. You look at clustering, at constellations, at community. But it seems to me that the theorizing of community is less evident in the presentation than it perhaps might be, especially with respect to tribalized forms of response versus more attenuated, values-based stuff, which doesn't change much, it seems to me you're saying.
Absolutely. So I don't know what context will look like once we've, distributed it across our hierarchies and pursue work, but sure, for sure. So once, you get sort of work on how things constellate going and how they, sort of anchor themselves around axicons and bondicons, then you can begin, I guess, to start theorizing about different kinds of relationships between constellations. I mean, all we know now is, okay, we have this polarization. Maybe there's other kinds of relationships. Maybe there's different kinds of constellations, ones that are more around bondicons, as you're suggesting, ones that are more around axicons, and they have a different kind of shape, purview, or whatever. I mean, who knows what's happening there? We don't have like straight rank metafunctions, all those kind of categories for sorting things out. It's just a matter now of groping and feeling our way. And ultimately, it depends on just analyzing more texts, finding more and more relevant texts that, help you try to understand these processes. But sometimes a single text, you'll be able to study the iconization process in the text. Sometimes you need to be looking at an individual and their development through the lifetime. Sometimes you're looking at a culture. It's a large, unwieldy operation, as you can imagine. And, the point will have to come where hopefully we can find sociologists and critical theorists and anthropologists and people who do worry about culture that find what we're doing interesting. I don't know if we know enough yet to engage, talk to them in any way that they would find interesting, actually. I don't know. I don't know if we're near that as yet. Yeah. So you're muted. You're muted, Mary. Can somebody unmute Mary? I can't hear her.
Okay, so now I just want to say this paper goes a long way to that kind of engagement. I think many sociologists or anthropologists listening to this would find it very challenging and very engaging and accessible. It was a perfect distillation of the big issues. I really appreciate
that's encouraging. Good. Good.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I asked Ken to put his question. You can see it in more detail in the chat. But I think Ken wants to talk about children.
Hi, Ken here.
I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about the distinction between, say, the use of judgment and affect in these iconization, because from what you have shown so far, the evilification that you're talking about seems to center around judgment, whereas the examples that you give of hope, particularly the examples of the children, there's mentioning of everything from hope to friendship to suffering. All of these seem to focus quite heavily on affect. I know in your previous work, when you're discussing Paul Keating, you have mentioned recontextualization from affect to judgment, but I'm just wondering, in this case, do you see some kind of recontextualization to affect instead?
I've never thought about it, Ken. That's a really great question and something to think about and pursue. Yeah, which of the different attitude variables plays more heavily? It maybe goes to Mary's question too, in certain types of constellating and certain types of constellations. Is there particular things that people play? Yeah. I don't know if we could say in relation to children it's solely affectual, although the affectual part is very strong. I think there's quite a strong judgmental aspect to that too. Yeah. I do think ultimately the appreciation lets you stand back a little bit. It's a little more of an observer's view of what's going on. The two books I mentioned by the Palestinian writers, the one by the poet on the right-hand side. Don't know if I can get this slide up. make an interesting contrast here. If you wanted some data to work on to answer this question. Where are they? There. The one on the right is very strongly affectual. I mean, it's very hard to read in those terms. Beautifully written by a poet. The one on the left, I think, is more strongly judgmental. It would be interesting to study the complementarity of these two books and the way they approach the issue. Same kind of discussion. Yeah. All right, Ken, thanks. Over to you. Carry on.
So thank you very much, Jim. I think we've got most of those questions done. If anybody would like to put their hand up who wants to explore anything else further. Here's Esther. Esther's saying, as for engaging other disciplines, so that's sociologists, etc., I just wanted to mention that in the past few years, I've been collaborating with sociologists, criminologists, and media strategic communication scholars, and they usually comment that they don't have frameworks to get into the language.
All right. So maybe we can have fair trade and we can get some help with building our frameworks to think about cosmology, let's say, call it that.
I've sort of got one more question, if that's all right, my own.
Fire away.
It seems when you use this metaphor, and in general it's used, the charging of the icon, is this the sort of idea that if it's not the kind of battery that just keeps going, it sort of drains, the energy sort of drains out of it. So, or a penny coin, as you mentioned in the Qantas, it's perfectly solid. The penny coin's perfectly solid. It's got all of its symbology, but it's of no use because it hasn't been continually passed around.
Looking at Marie's work, and when I've thought about these things, it just seems okay. It's a process iconization, so you can, be adding feeling and, attenuating ideation. I just think at some point there's a flip. There's a flip comes when it, flips over, I think Marie would say, into a bondicon, and it just becomes some kind of nuclear center. Now, I don't think she's done interesting studies of this, of the Olympic flame. So have her look at her work in terms of Olympic flame. She's done something a little more historical in terms of the Croatian tie. I think a particular symbol coming out of their, fighting on horseback originally and how it became a symbol for Croatia. So we need that kind of historical view, trying to look at it over time and try to see what can we see that's criterial when something just becomes, charged to the point where we have to recognize it as a different kind of entity. I don't know how to do that now, but it's an important thing to worry about. Yeah. So we don't just say, as people are worrying, well, that is a bondicon, obviously, and that community treats it as such, obviously, but how did it get there? Maybe studying the like something de-iconizing as well. So I remember when I first was working on this, it was around like Howard refusing to apologize for the stolen generations, and William Dean, our Governor General, was a very important bondicon at that time, and the things he represented at that time. And so you could see over a period of the Howard years, his star rising and becoming a bondicon, and then I imagine we could study it waning afterwards as that issue died away and Rudd apologized and so on. So you want to be looking at this from both directions. So how things become bondicons and axicons, and then how they kind of dissolve, or it'll go, it's a two-way process, so it'll go both ways over time. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Mm.
Well, the chat is also full of appreciation.
Oh, that's nice. Good. Talk like this, you never know. You produce lots of stunned silence with the imaging as well. It's maybe a little easier to digest in its paper form because you don't have to look at the images. So, on the other hand, the images have lots of impact as well. Yeah.
I was interested in that poster contrast of I Can't Breathe and Black Lives Matter where you've got the background of the individuals concerned as well. So there's sort of you look at, I suppose, from whatever standpoint you're in, whoever the victim of those policemen.
Yeah.
It adds some axiological charge there as well, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the whole general problem of invocation. We're going to react, to the ideation. Of course we will, in terms of our belongings. And the ideation alone doesn't tell us what that is. Okay. It's, our interpretation. And yeah, that's part of the story. And, it's interpersonal. It's, famous for being a difficult area where things are a bit ineffable and we have lots of clines, and sometimes it feels hard to draw the line between inscribing and invoking, but I think we have to keep pushing, and we've made lots of progress with the cline of invoking and inscribing, for example, and we've made clines thinking about all the different kinds of bondicons. I think we just have to keep pushing at the interpersonal and push at the grading and push at the ineffability and, try to get our hands around it because it so powerfully shapes our lives. Can't avoid it. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Thanks from everybody in the chat. And I'll just hand back to Ingrid now to close off our seminar. Thank you so much, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I just need to know, will someone be able to download the chat for me, because I don't know how to do it. Thank you. Thanks. And just in case there are a few other questions there that maybe.
Okay, that would be wonderful to see that. I'll try to answer people, Yeah.
So thank you everyone for coming to this. It's been wonderful, a great turnout for our first webinar this year, and a star presenter, which has been fantastic. I think, there's a lot that people can take away from this, and hopefully, as you say, push the boundaries to get more for more research on all of this iconisation and the bondicons and the axicons and what have you, for looking at semiotics of peace, compassion, and empathy. I think it's been fantastic. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for having me. Thank you very much. Okay, bye. Nice to see everybody, old friends and people from around the world, and anyone else I don't know. Hi, and thanks for coming. See you. Bye.
Bye.
See you. So I will just stop the recording. Stop.